xenophobia. The fear of foreigners, I've already said, check zero tolerance. Okay, xenophobia simply means you're kind of afraid of foreigners. And when you think about that also, I just want to draw your attention. Sometimes there's a lot of emotional debate about this in the United States, okay? And the first book you're reading in this course, of course, is by Ronald Takaki, which is about a different mirror, which is about immigrants. But when you read the history very, very carefully, you find out that across the United States, there are communities, call them counties or whatever, that have done an excellent job in trying to kind of help immigrants adapt and adjust, okay? In some places, some of the politicians have decided to politicize that and create a kind of like enmity against the immigrants. But in some communities, actually there's a documentary called New Faces on Main Street, where they did this case study in Eau Claire, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and some other places in the Midwest. And when you check, you're going to find out that these are small communities, but the communities have approached this issue really differently. So, but the idea is just that when you have immigrants, sometimes you may see them and feel afraid of them, okay? And this can happen in so many ways, but just bear this in mind. I have gone through it myself and experienced, because one of the things sometimes I've experienced in the United States is that I am somebody who is so interested and passionate in the history of the United States. I like history. History was my best subject when I was in college and when I was in high school. So I like to study the history of the United States. I've taught Western humanities and I love it really very, very much. But sometimes when you meet with some people, as an immigrant, they don't expect you to know a lot about the United States. And when you start talking really very seriously, quoting your references and things like that, they may feel uneasy about it because they don't expect you as an immigrant to know this. So there are a lot of ways that immigrants sometimes can make some people very uncomfortable. And if you check, you're going to find out that this kind of feeling has impacted our Naturalization Act. In many of our Naturalization Act, for instance, have accommodated this. So, for instance, at one point, you just need to be here for 2 years residence before you can become a citizen, citizen. And then later it became 5 years, and at some point they even increased it to 14 years, okay? Just because they are concerned really about that. So what are some of these other, let me conclude by just looking at what are some of the other reactions during this period to immigrants, which will all create an environment for social war. One, the creation of the Know-Nothings Party of 1840s and 1850s, which was anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, and anti-black feelings. So there was a whole political party that was created, Know-Nothings Party, okay? Of course, today it's going to be very difficult for such a party to be allowed to exist, but in those days it really existed. And then there was a nativist sentiment. Nativist sentiment is like, we are the founders and things like that. If there's a book written by Samuel Huntington titled Who Are We? Where in this book, for instance, he made the argument that the Europeans who came here are not immigrants, or were not immigrants, they were settlers. Okay? And so you can't call them immigrants, they are like the founders. So, but amazingly, throughout his discussion, it's like Native Americans were reduced to the footnote of history. Okay? So because if Europeans came here and they could claim that they are not immigrants, they are settlers, so they have the right to define this country, then what about Native Americans? Okay? It's a very interesting book that has generated a lot of discussion. So this is a kind of like nativist sentiment. Okay? We are the founders and we are this. But on the other hand, within America too, within American history, there's cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism here simply means, as I mentioned much earlier, people who are very broad-minded. I think, if I was not mistaken, Thomas Jefferson had something in his library, a copy of the Quran or something like that, okay? The Holy Quran in Islam or something like that. And I think, if I remember very well, when the Attorney General of Minnesota was to be sworn in the U.S. House of Representatives, because he's a Muslim, he requested, at that time he's a Muslim, I do not know now, but he requested a copy of that Holy Quran that was actually owned by Thomas Jefferson, okay? So you know that Thomas Jefferson was somebody who was very engaged intellectually or something like that. So that's an example of cosmopolitanism, okay? He, of course, he is not necessarily a Christian. In my office, I just packed my books the other day, and I saw a copy of his Bible, his own Bible, where he eliminated all the miracles in the New Testament. He just had the teachings of Jesus because, so he's kind of like influenced by Christian teaching, but he doesn't really call himself like a traditional Christian. So cosmopolitan way of thinking. Okay, slave population ignored in public involuntary social welfare. So what I'm just trying to say here is just that during this period, even though there were economic and social reforms, generally when there was a discussion on economic and social reform, black people were treated as a non-entity. So what do I mean by a non-entity? A non-entity is like you exist, but you are treated as non-existent, okay, or non-existent. So in other words, you are there, you're part of the organization or you're part of the society, but when decisions are made, it's like people do not even acknowledge that you're there, talk less of what are your interests and how do your interests come, or how are your interests reflected in the decisions that are being made. And Native American population, the Native American population was devastated. There was the Removal Act of 1830 known as the Trail of Tears. There's a whole documentary about this documentary film. If you want to know this, you're going to see how they were forced to move across the Mississippi, and it was just something really, really very difficult and painful at that time. And then I would just like to conclude by saying that there was territorial expansion during this period. The country grew from 13 states to 33 states. And by around this period, during this period also, the borders of the United States were set, both in the north, in the south, in the west, and in the east. Okay. Now, there are other things I would have loved to talk about, but I think it's good to just keep it here. This is very relevant for you to understand the context around this period, what was happening in the early period of the United States, the history of this country, okay? And we have talked about so many things. And I think the important thing, one of the important things I want to draw your attention to in concluding is just that the United States did not just drop from the sky. The sky just opened one day and just came down perfectly. If you are in the United States, I know that we still have some things we're struggling with. We're still having some concerns about this and that. But when you look back at history, you will see how we have made significant progress, okay? And if you are listening to this and you're not even an American, just understand that you're not going to solve problems just overnight. You need to organize, because a lot of the things that happened that changed the United States came into existence because some people organized. And many of these people who organized and formed social movements were not necessarily people who needed. Of course, there are people who needed or who are going to benefit from these reforms, but there are some people who are not going to directly benefit from these reforms. But it was about conscience, it was about human dignity, which is something that is at the core of social work. It's about social justice. And when I say social justice, again, I want to say that contrary to what some people think, it's not about socialism or communism or whatever, but justice has to be social because it's about our human relationships, okay? So the idea here is just that many people in the United States participated in social movements, not because they were going to directly benefit from that, but because they thought it was a question of human dignity and a question of social justice. So this idea of organizing and reforming society is what brought us to where we are. And I hope people will continue to work together also to improve American society so that if the world doesn't end in the next 50 years, America would be a better country than what it is today. Thank you very much.
All right.
No, thank you.